This is the start of the new series on my channel called The Nightly Outlook, where I analyze and inform you of different topics, mainly fairy tales, but sometimes other things. Today we'll be starting the series off with a bang, namely my favorite fairy tale, Cinderella. Cinderella means a lot to me. The Disney version was how I got introduced to her, as I'm sure the same could be said for most of you watching. She's hardworking, kind, doesn't give up on her dreams, and her hard work pays off in the end, a role model for a young child surely. But as I got to researching more into Cinderella in my spare time, I came to really appreciate the different takes on her and the entire story formula as a whole. Let me explain. We'll start with the obvious question. Where did the Cinderella story come from? Well, there are several ancient myths, which include several Cinderella motifs, but aren't easily recognizable as Cinderella stories themselves. This includes, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation here probably, so forgive me, Egypt's Rapidus, Greece's Apasia, and the Jewess' Senath. But the first records of an actual Cinderella story as we know it today comes from China, before or during the Qian and Han dynasties. Sources vary. I'll go into more detail into this story itself later on in the video. Other pre-modern day Cinderella stories include, and I'm probably going to mess up more pronunciations here, so forgive me, the Algonquin Native Americans of North America created the rough-faced girl. There's a West African interpretation called Chinye. There's a folktale from Zimbabwe called Nyasha. The British put a twist on the formula with tattered coats. The French author Charles Perrault published Cinderella, and this is the version which was immortalized by Walt Disney, complete with fairy godmother, pumpkin carriage, and the glass slipper. The Brothers Grimm retell a dark Cinderella story called Aschenputtel, and Cinderella is a Northern European interpretation that recalls worship of the pagan goddess Hele. I will not be talking about every single story mentioned here, but it's interesting to see just how far this formula has reached. From Europe to Africa to Asia, it seems children and adults from all over the world have some kind of memory of Cinderella. But where did her popularity come from? That is to say, I'm addressing the elephant in the room. Arguably the most popular and widespread version of the story out there, Disney's Cinderella. This is how I'm sure many of us got introduced to the fairy tale to begin with, so I want to talk about the troubled history behind Walt Disney's older films and what it did to fairy tales as a whole. Now I give the movie credit for giving Cinderella more agency and initiative than in Parlo's original version of the story, and I'll go into this later on in the video. But as mentioned before, Disney has a bit of a troubled history when it comes to the reputation with fairy tales. Walt Disney made fairy tale content for a very long time, and his company continues his work. And I give credit where it's due that he gave a lot of people access to a viewable source of fairy tales that they might not otherwise have been able to enjoy. But in the same breath, one could say that he, and the company itself later on, has made an attack on the literary tradition of fairy tales. They made their fairy tales, especially the older movies, very one-dimensional and very American. He geared the older films for non-reflective viewing. Everything is to be taken at surface value, and there's no character development because all the characters are archetypes. There's an emphasis on how things are animated in a technical way rather than a narrative way. I'm not saying there's nothing good about the original Disney film. After all, it was my first glimpse into the iceberg that is the Cinderella story. But as a whole, Disney took away the literary importance. The traditional orally told fairy tales have now lost their voice and changed form entirely. And he made them simple, for better or worse. He made them easily consumable for all ages, which on paper seems fine. But once again, he took away the literary and oral importance of fairy tales. All the development, symbolism, nuanced writing, it was all lost when he simplified the formula for his target audience. It doesn't start and end with Disney though. Thankfully there are a lot of other adaptations, or more modern and better sourced adaptations, for our viewing pleasure. I won't go into every adaptation of Cinderella out there, we'd be here all day, as there were over 130 adaptations made in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century alone. But special mention to Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, the one from 1997. Please go watch that one if you haven't. It's a personal favorite, but I highly recommend it for its visual and narrative differences for most Cinderella stories out there. But on to other literary Cinderella stories. I will count for you 4 different versions of Cinderella, 2 of which I'll do a comparison on later in the video. Let's start with that most ancient Cinderella story from China. It starts off with the same story beat we're used to. A young woman is mistreated by her stepmother. One day while getting water, she caught a fish that was about 2 inches long with red fins and golden eyes. She cared for the fish, but it eventually grew like 5 times its length. She had to put it back into the pond because she could no longer care for it in a bowl. The fish only appeared for the girl, and the girl would feed it extra food that she managed to get. The stepmother found out about this fish and asked for the girl's clothes under the guise of getting her new ones. She put on her stepdaughter's clothes, killed the fish, and then ate it. Our heroine was devastated, but a wise old man appeared from the heavens, in some versions, and said to gather the bones of the fish and pray to them, and surely whatever she wants will come true. She wanted to go to a festival. It's unclear when this exactly took place, either directly after the fish was killed or later on. She was given a cloak of kingfisher feathers and shoes of gold, which she wore this to the festival. But her stepmother and her stepsister actually recognized her, so she had to run away from the scene, losing one of her shoes in the process. From here, I found two distinctly different versions of the ending of the story. Through my online research, I found a version that a merchant finds the shoe and tries to sell it, but later ends up in the king's hands, and the king has the man tortured to try to figure out where it came from. Later on, the town is ransacked by the king's men trying to find the owner of the slipper. Yin Shan reveals herself, and then they are married, and the king takes the bones from her and wishes on them for a year. However, the second year, the fish bones don't work. In the book Cinderella, the Ultimate Collection, the merchant gives the shoe to the king as he understands its value, and the king wishes to find the owner of the slipper. So he puts it on display in a pavilion to find the owner. One dark night, Yin Xian tried to get her slipper back, but the king's men had been waiting nearby and brought her before the king. The king refused to think that someone in rags could fit such a beautiful slipper, but recognized her beauty and had his men accompany her home, where she gave them the matching slipper. The king and Yin Qian was married and lived happily, while the stepmother and stepsister at some point were crushed to death by a shower of flying rocks. In this version, the fish stops granting Yin Xian's wishes after the festival. Next we have a rare male Cinderella interpretation, with the story of the Black Cow. It starts off with familiar story beats, a second marriage, and a stepmother that brings a stepsister into the house. And of course, the stepmother is awful to the son. The stepmother makes him eat cakes made out of ashes, mixed with a tiny bit of flour so they appear fine, but obviously they are not. The boy was too scared to speak up on the matter, understandably. Instead, he wept from hunger in a forest, and a black cow asked him what was the matter. He told her what had happened, and then she beat her hooves against the ground and sweets appeared. He shared these sweets with his little stepsister on the condition that she didn't tell her mother anything. The stepsister and the male Cinderella here seem to have a decent relationship in the story. His stepmother wondered why the boy was in perfect shape despite not eating, and she found that he had been drinking milk from the black cow as well as knowing about the sweets because little sister confessed about the sweets when confronted. The stepmother told her husband to sell the cow, but before it could be done, the boy learned of this and ran off with the cow, the two escaping together. Within the forest they ran into, there was a hole, which led to the home of the great snake, which together with a bowl held up the universe. Letting that sink in for a second. The cow poured milk down the hole every day to feed the snake, and when the snake came up to see who had been so kind to feed him, he found the two. The great snake wanted to grant a wish for the cow, but the cow simply wanted her son, which is what she calls the hero at this point, to be clothed in gold and to shine like gold. But unfortunately, this turned out to be a bad idea because now they feared robbers. When the boy was bathing in a river, his hair fell into the river and got swallowed by a fish. The fish was then caught by a fisherman, and the fisherman gave it to the king, and when it was cut open, they found the golden hair. The king's daughter said she wished to find the owner of such perfect hair, and the king sent men far and wide to find them. Some of the king's men happened upon the boy when he was bathing again, caught him and tied him up and carried him to the palace. But this was more of a happy story because the princess and him were married and spent many happy days together. But then he remembered his dear old cow mother and went into a frenzy of remorse, speeding off to the forest where he had last seen her, only to find bones. He was heartbroken and gathered the bones for a funeral pyre, which he said he would lay down his life upon, but the black cow suddenly appeared to stop him. She had kept the bones there as a test of his affection, and now that they are reunited, the kingdom held a feast for many days before the two went on their separate ways. Now onto Parlot's version. I won't recount this version in too much detail, as it's pretty much the Disney version of the story. However, I will mention a few things. Cinderella chooses to sleep among the ashes in this version. The stepsisters are more the ones to ask if she wants to go to the ball, in a more joking manner, and she doesn't even start to have the idea until they ask. The fairy godmother has Cinderella collect all the items to later use magic upon, and she forgives her stepsisters in the end, even finding them high-ranking officials to marry. Now onto the Brothers Grimm version of the tale. The wife of a rich man fell ill and died. The daughter would go to her grave every day to pray and cry. The father was remarried in the spring of that same year. The stepmother brought two nasty stepsisters home as well. One day the father was going to a fair and asked each daughter what they wanted. The first stepsister said beautiful dresses, the second said pearls and jewels, and Cinderella simply asked for the first branch of the tree that brushed against his hat on the way home. He gave each of the girls what they wanted when he returned, and Cinderella buried the twig by her mother's grave. She cried so much onto the soil that it was watered and gave root to a large and beautiful tree. When she would go to her mother's grave to pray, once the tree was fully bloomed, a white bird would appear and bring her anything she wished for. Later on, a festival was going on that was being held by the king, and the stepsisters forced Cinderella to help them get ready. When she later asked her stepmother if she could go, she was denied until the stepmother put out tasks for her, dumping lentils into the ashes of the fireplace, and she was to separate them within a time limit, and then she could go. She did this twice, but she was still denied because she didn't have anything nice to wear and couldn't dance, and therefore would be embarrassment to the family if she went. Cinderella went to the grave of her mother and prayed for silver and gold to watch over her. Then the bird brought down a dress made of gold and silver and shoes embroidered with silk and silver. She went to the festival and was chosen by the prince as his partner of the night, but before it got too late, she managed to slip away from him and go back home before her family could discover she was gone, tossing the dress and shoes up to the bird to take away so they weren't discovered. The festival was held for 3 nights, and she escaped all 3 nights, but on the 3rd night, the prince put pitch on the stairs, and she lost one of her shoes. The prince declared he would marry whoever the shoe fits. Of course, the prince eventually comes to Cinderella's house, but the stepmother has her locked away somewhere so her daughters could try to marry the prince instead. She cut off pieces of her daughter's feet so that they would fit the shoe and be taken away by the prince. But each time, the birds nearby would make the prince look back and see that there was blood in the shoe. Finally, Cinderella was released, cleaned up, and presented before the prince. She tried on the shoe, and he finally recognized her as the one he had been dancing with at the festival. The stepsisters were punished at Cinderella's wedding by having their eyes poked out by birds, first when they entered the church and later when they left. And this is where I would put donkey skin or the princess in the suit of leather, if they didn't have incest in them. Incest is gross, I don't need to explain why, and it's not a topic I will be discussing on this channel. I understand there's a significance to these stories in the overall history of Cinderella, but that doesn't mean I want to talk about them. You're free to read them in your spare time, but I will not be talking about them here, and please don't leave comments about these versions of Cinderella either. Thank you. Now back to the different versions of Cinderella. Parlot's Cinderella and Grimm's Aschenputtel. These are probably the most popular and most different versions of Cinderella, so let's take a second to compare them. First off, when were these stories even made? Parlot's version was made in the 17th century, while Grimm's was made a whole 200 years later in the 19th century. And for clarification, I'm talking about the 1857 version of the Grimm tale, as it's regarded as the rewrite to the 1812 counterpart. Yeah, there's actually 2 versions. I wasn't sure about that until my research. Now for the intended audience of both versions. Parlot's was made for more courtly reading, while Grimm's was made for the common people. And you must consider other factors of the audience as well, like the ruling religion at the time. Parlot's takes place in a Catholic society in which goodness and forgiveness are fundamental, and sins can be forgiven through confession. Parlot's text emphasizes the good attitude of the heroine that brings her to even forgive her stepsisters in the end with all of her heart, to the point that she even finds them good lords for husbands. Grimm's tale takes place in a Protestant society in which only God has the power to punish or absolve. It highlights how the sisters are the ones being punished for their wickedness and their malice. 2 doves peck out their eyes as they walk in and out of the church for the wedding of the heroine. Now, speaking of highlights in the narrative, Parlot's version has the beginning of the text itself start with fewer actions and more descriptions. It is told through a narrator with a strong presence who organizes the various elements of the story into a narrative. The narrative starts by reconstituting a family composed of a widower and his daughter of unparalleled goodness and sweetness and temper. Meanwhile, the stepsisters who come in to the scene are the complete opposite of the heroine, creating a clear parallel between the two at the start of the story. Grimm's version opens up with a sequence of actions rather than descriptions. The mother dying, Cinderella mourning, the father's second marriage. The events seem to tell themselves and follow a chronological order of events, with no need for added explanations. The text emphasizes the special bond between the heroine and her dying mother, and the hope from the latter that the heroine will be good and pious. It starts off with a dramatic separation of family rather than reconstituting of it. Now for the heroine specifically. Parlot's version of the heroine is more witty, proves resourceful when helping the fairy godmother, and also demonstrates her goodness, which is associated with her sweetness of temper. This is the moral Parlot wishes to convey for girls going to court in the 17th century. In the Grimm version, the heroine is more active, mastering magic and taking action through her own devices, not because someone told her or reminded her of it. In terms of morality, Grimm's version consequently always appears to overcome adversity because she follows her mother's advice. She remains good and pious. Now, speaking of magic in the tale, Parlot's version actually doesn't use that much magic, and when it does, it's through a logical manner. Magic doesn't obey the laws of nature, but it does have restrictions, and the fairy godmother can't create something from nothing. Meanwhile, in the Grimm's version, they don't try to rationalize the magic, and the elements remain unexplained. The heroine isn't told what to do, but goes forward progressively, planting the tree branch herself, caring for the tree itself, and then calling upon the birds without them showing up first, etc. There are a few other minor details that differ, such as the role of the father, which in Grimm's version appears at the beginning and end of the story, and Parlot's is completely absent, and the true villain of the story, in which the Parlot version has mostly the stepsisters being the antagonists, while the Grimm version has mostly the stepmother being the antagonist. Overall, Parlot and Grimm both had their stories to tell. However, there was definitely a drastic gap in audience and source material. Parlot and Grimm had different takes on the fairy tale genre as well. Their meanings and lessons were drastically different from one another, and the argument isn't so much who told it better, but which version gets their point across, I suppose. Or maybe there isn't an argument at all. Maybe we should just enjoy each version for what it is. Still, that likely won't stop me and many others from comparing the two and talking about them. Personally, I do prefer the Grimm version, but that's probably just because I like the darker tone. Which version is your favorite? Feel free to tell me in the comment section down below. Now, I'm not done dissecting the story yet. There's one factor that these two stories have in common: the slipper. Tiny foot sizes used to be appealing in more ancient times. It represented a mark of extraordinary virtue, beauty, and distinction. Now put this into concept of the glass slipper itself. It could represent the same kind of values for the right bride that the prince is looking for. Had he been looking at Cinderella's personality or personal looks, he wouldn't have been so easily deceived. It got to the point in the Grimm fairy tale version that he was already on horseback with the stepsisters and specifically had to be told by the birds nearby that the slipper had blood in it, indicating these women did not have the traits he was looking for. It's awfully telling he had to be told to look at the slippers, but we'll let it slide for now. This isn't an analyst about the prince. In contrast, Cinderella fitting the shoe and even putting it on and off is showing that she does have those qualities, but it's not all of who she is. She's able to make her own fate by choosing to put the slipper back on and leave with the prince. There is also something that could be said about the materials that the slippers are made out of. It should be noted that Parlot's version was the one to coin the glass slipper, perhaps representing the fragile nature of glass and how easily it is for one not to be virtuous, as everyone else ends up breaking the slipper that the prince brought, while she is able to keep the spare pristine. Most other versions of the tale have the slipper made of silver or gold, which are precious materials, and anyone who has them could obviously be seen as higher class and worthy of an audience. It's a fascinating topic to think about, but I won't be rambling on and on about it. We've covered different versions of Cinderella up until this point, talked about the differences between some of the versions of the tale, and even touched upon the symbolism of the slipper. But the big question is, why? Why do people like this fairy tale so much? What is the meaning behind it? Why should we care about Cinderella? Based on the Brothers Grimm version specifically, you could say that the meaning of the story itself is developing a personality and keeping a good moral code. The Brothers Grimm laid out 5 steps for this. The first is basic trust, represented on what is firmly instilled in Cinderella's personality at the start of the story, mostly her relationship with her family, but especially her mother. The second is autonomy. Cinderella accepts her unique role and makes the best of it. The third is initiative. She wants to go to the ball, she wants to have a pretty dress, she wants to marry the prince. She takes action towards having these things. The fourth is industry, represented in Cinderella's harsh labors and overcoming them. The fifth is identity. Cinderella escapes from the ball, but she keeps coming back. She has the prince accept one side of her before she's willing to reveal the other side. To the Brothers Grimm, these 5 elements help make up a heroine and the personality of someone who can achieve their goals. Based on the Parlot version, you could say the meaning is similar to the live-action Disney film catchphrase of "have courage and be kind. Forgiveness is always an option." But what if we combine all the Cinderellas together? What is the meaning of the story? Why does everyone like Cinderella? I think there's a misconception here that Cinderella is a rags to riches story, and that's why everyone likes it. But Cinderella is not a rags to riches story. Despite all of her hard work, she still has outside help through fairy godmothers, God sending doves out from on high. I'm not taking her hard work away from her. She does her best to overcome her obstacles and stand up to her abusers. But that doesn't take away that she's of more noble birth and had an upbringing of one, at least until the stepfamily came in. This is not a rags to riches story. It never was. So what is it? Now this is a personal opinion, and you're free to leave your opinions in the comment section down below, but Cinderella is an underdog story. She stands up for what she believes is right. Even when she's torn down by her stepfamily, she gets back up again. Sometimes she needs help along the way, but that's okay. Her hard work pays off, and she's able to stay true to her own beliefs the entire time. She's able to show up her stepfamily, become someone she can truly be proud of. Maybe this is a little cliche and watered down, and you're free to call me basic. This video is simply to inform others of different versions of Cinderella and let them form their own conclusions. For me, that conclusion is that Cinderella is an underdog, and she's a fine representation one of that. So like Cinderella, look out for magic, because your happily ever after could be right around the corner. I hope you've all learned to appreciate fairy tales through this video, or at least maybe Cinderella a little bit more, and thank you for watching. Alright, new recruits, dismissed.